Good afternoon. I'd like to officially welcome all of you to the Stockbridge Library, Museum, and Archives online poetry program. And we are in our third season. A little bit about the program. John Gillespie, who started the program back in 2020 and organizes our poet sessions for the last 3 years, was at the time the president of the Board of Trustees of the Stockbridge Library. And of course, no one could any longer have library readings or author talks in person. So John thought this would be a great idea to get us through that short time when we were going to be on lockdown. And what ended up happening is it was so popular, the program, that we've continued on through today and into our third season. Our theme this season is inquiry and the power of poetry in both asking and answering questions. This week, we are delighted to have with us Elizabeth Sylvia. Elizabeth is an English teacher in Eastern Massachusetts, and she teaches high school English. Her first publication in 2019 started her being published in a range of magazines and journals. None But Witches came out in 2022, and that was her first book. It won the 2021 3 Mile Harbor Book Prize, and was a series of reflections on the female experience through Shakespeare's female characters. And that actually began with a New Year's resolution that Elizabeth had to read all of the Shakespeare plays in a single year. I'd be interested to hear how that went. Elizabeth is currently working on poems exploring Marie Antoinette and a very light and small subject, the end of the world. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to turn the program over to you, John, and you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, Wendy, thank you. And Elizabeth, thanks for joining us today. Yeah, the Shakespeare. Yeah, we have to hear about the Shakespeare too. You've got a heavy agenda today. You got to, you got the history of Mattapoisett, the Bourne Bridge, Shakespeare, the witches, your students. Yeah, this is like a 3-hour show, Perry. So make sure you got enough water as we paddle down the river on this one. Now, the first question I always ask is, what does inquiry mean to you?
So as a teacher, inquiry is absolutely fundamental to my professional experience. Like basically what I teach students is the desire to and ability to be interested in things in the world. And I think that's fundamentally what inquiry is about. Like all inquiry starts with curiosity. And then when you have curiosity, and when you pursue that curiosity, that's what inquiry is. And so for me, if I want to tie this specifically into my project, when I started my plan to read Shakespeare in a year, which, by the way, I always feel I need to tell people it took me 2 years to finish all of the plays. Like, I'm not a super reader. I started because I was interested in Shakespeare's language, but through my curiosity about language, I became very engaged in the way that characters were developed and the people who were in them. And then I became really super interested in my own reaction to that experience. Like, why did I care so much about that? And so I think what is powerful about inquiry is that every question that we ask can actually raise another question.
Interesting. So was there any specific play or character that kind of tipped you over the edge?
The absolutely first poem that I wrote was about Lavinia in Titus Andronicus. For those of you who might not be 100% on your Shakespeare, Titus Andronicus is just like this beginning to end bloodbath where everybody is out to get revenge on everyone else. And Lavinia is the daughter of the title character. She is raped by the sons of someone that Titus Andronicus took prisoner, and then they cut out her tongue and they cut off of her hands so that
Oof.
she can't say who did it. And then at the very end of the play, her own father slits her throat so that she won't have to live with the shame of it. And I was reading these plays in 2018, which was also when the Me Too movement was happening. And it felt a little bit like, here is this legacy of suffering, and then not just to the violation itself, but the way that the representation is, the way that that violation is responded to. It felt kind of like the backlash against Me Too, and it, obviously in a much more dramatic way. And so it felt like this play was kind of reaching out across time to say, the things that Shakespeare was talking about are still happening now.
So with your students, you talked about inquiry being a very essential tool for them. Is it something that, you give specific instructions about, or is it more general guidance about, as you read this or as you write this, how do they kind of get into the inquiry mode? Or don't get into the inquiry mode because they're looking at their phones. I don't know.
No, well, I mean, everybody uses their phone, but the phone can be a great tool for inquiry as well. So I never want to disparage young people for having different methods of understanding the world than maybe, us old folks have. But I do think that inquiry is something that has to be practiced, because a lot of times inquiry occurs in the place where we don't know anymore. And it can be very uncomfortable to be in a place of not knowing, especially when, I think culturally and to some extent in schools as well, not knowing is not always rewarded. So to be comfortable in a space where you don't know the answer and you're willing to accept that you don't know the answer and you have to keep moving forward, even though you're in over your head, is essential to inquiry. But you can only develop the endurance to do that through doing it. So you have to kind of be willing to swim out over your head all the time, I think, to be. And I was, to some extent over my head with Shakespeare. I'm not a Shakespeare scholar. I'm just an enthusiast. And I had a kind of arc of emotion when I read this. Like, there was a point at which I was so sick of Shakespeare while I was reading these plays, because I was really tired of what was happening to the women in Shakespeare's plays. And, I care about the other characters too, but it can be hard not to personalize the experience of characters that you feel are most like you. And in Shakespeare, I read the plays chronologically, and in the beginning, there are a lot of mothers. In the first half of Shakespeare's canons, there are a lot of mothers, and mothers have a terrible experience in Shakespeare. Like, their kids are always getting killed. They are constantly being deposed and kicked off stage and denigrated. And they mostly, all of what these mothers want is just for their kids to be safe. And Shakespeare will not let them have that safety. And the other characters who really get a bad hand in Shakespeare are young women who want to marry without their parents' consent. Reading chronologically, there's 38 Shakespeare plays, and reading chronologically, it's not until the 21st play where a young woman marries against her parents' will, and either she doesn't die or her parent doesn't die. In every other play, if you marry against your parents' will, either you'll die or one of your parents will die. And so, there's these two really strong themes of how terrible it is to care about other people when you're a woman in Shakespeare, I think. But my book really isn't totally about that, although it comes up sometimes.
I think you're moving beyond the enthusiast stage. We'll have to give you a
Should
couple more merit badges on this one with your. So let me ask you this. So inquiry sounds like it's a pretty strong current that runs through, your life and your work. So how does it show up in your poems? And what I mean by that is, does it arrive kind of organically? You're writing or something, and all of a sudden there's a question that forms out of your writing, or are you thinking about, I need some inquiry in this thing. I'm not asking the right questions.
I think that the inquiry often comes before the poem, that the inquiry is the impetus that brings the poem. And the poem itself is the journey towards answering the inquiry. So if I open with, why do I relate to this? Why am I interested in this? Then through writing the poem, I come to have an understanding of that.
Okay. No, great. Some people want to embed inquiry. Some people, it just kind of shows up unannounced. So I was just wondering how I think for everyone, it's a little bit different. So, no, good.
And let me say, I don't think most poems are really answers to a question, but I think they're explorations of a question. And that leave, I hope, the reader oftentimes with possibilities. And so having said that, should I read some poems or should
Yeah,
I answer some
absolutely. I
more?
was going to suggest that. Yes, please.
Well, one of the things that I think inquiry allows you to do is to change your mind. And so I thought I would open this by talking about two poems that I wrote that are called Shakespeare's Women, and then Palinode for Shakespeare's Women. There is one slightly bad word in the second poem, students. A palinode is a poem where you actually retract what you said in an earlier poem. So you decide that you were wrong about what you were going to say. So when I was about 10 plays into Shakespeare, I wrote this poem, Shakespeare's Women, because when I was feeling kind of cranky at William Shakespeare about what I felt like he was saying. Shakespeare's Women. I used to believe the men who told me Shakespeare was remarkable for making female characters who were as round as men. I don't believe that anymore. Instead, I think he wrote as he could write. What intelligence he casts into Juliet or Portia, just his own maleness animating them. It doesn't matter, finally, if they are witty or can solve a vexing problem. All they do is orbit, casting here and there reflected light. And when they light the path, it is a man's path they light. If they should darken it, it is the darkness of the path that worries us, and not the way their face has disappeared.
Very nice.
So that's how I was feeling for a while. And then I kept reading. And I think this is actually essential to inquiry, right? Like true inquiry doesn't end with your first answer. You have to kind of, I think, keep going in the direction of your questions, even when you have had a first answer. And so, so after I had read more, I changed my opinion a little bit. And I wrote a follow-up poem to my Shakespeare's Women poem. But I didn't want to throw my Shakespeare's Women poem away because I felt that that was authentic to one step on my journey. So here's my follow-up, my retraction of what I said earlier. Palinode, Shakespeare's Women. If you watch a lot of TV, especially critically acclaimed, you might come to suspect that a woman is a pair of boobs attached to broken, a hurt circuit flipped again and again. It's like we get written into believing we are the worst thing ever done to us. So I love how all the women in Shakespeare always say exactly what they think is true and are never only watery bags of damage about to burst all over the scene. When horrible things have been done to them, they want revenge, but not because vengeance is the only taste trauma leaves flowering in their mouths. Revenge is the word men use for restoration, for imagining justice in the world. In the comedies, they get their due and all returns to harmony. And when disaster ends in tragedy, the women forge on through blood, witnessing and roaring that we are more than would be made of us.
So who would be your favorite besides Lavinia? I mean, where does Lady Macbeth rank in this scheming? Yeah,
You know, so Lady Macbeth is not a particularly sympathetic character, right?
yeah,
But like, let's give Lady Macbeth props for she believes in her husband. Like
yeah, she
she
does.
has faith that he can be, you know, that he can be the man. Like I think she is a sort of a powerful figure behind the throne character. And to some extent, you know, her behavior is in no way unique in Shakespeare. Like men in Shakespeare do the terrible things that Lady Macbeth does all the time.
Yeah, that's right. I know.
You know, and yet she's the one who's sort of famous for being so terrible. But if you read especially Shakespeare's early history plays, like the Henry VI cycle, they never, like, there isn't one scene where somebody isn't betraying somebody else. That's all they do the whole play. They're not even like double crossers, they're like quadruple crossers all the time. So I think you know, Lady Macbeth is somewhat unique in being such a powerful female figure doing that, but her behavior is not unusual at all in the canon of Shakespeare. I think Shakespeare's world is a very destabilized world oftentimes.
Yeah. So do you have a few more poems to read for us right now? Then we'll do some Q&A.
Yeah. All right. So since we're talking about queens and about maybe a little bit about agency, I thought I would read a poem inspired by Shakespeare's play All Is True, which is actually his play about Henry VIII. This isn't super relevant to the poem, but I find this to be one of Shakespeare's most interesting plays, in the sense that, you know, Henry VIII was Queen Elizabeth's father. So Shakespeare's writing a play that's about the dad of the current queen, and that who beheaded her own mother, right? So that's, like, I think, a tricky position to be in. And he solves it by just ending his play about Henry VIII at Anne Boleyn's coronation. So a lot of that play is about the end of Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon and his falling in love with Anne Boleyn. And this is a persona poem from the point of view of Anne Boleyn. And it starts with an epigraph where she is saying to another lady in waiting, having noticed Henry VIII's attention to her, "It faints me to think what follows." This poem is called Subject. There is nothing to learn about being a queen. It subjects me while I sit here on a toy cushion, secret as the pit in a plum. Women are precious at being fruit. A lot depends on our patience, on being picked. If we are still enough, we can stay innocent. A crown's weight forbears a getaway. Like any subject, like anything subjected, I am within and without myself, known to enjoy and owe allegiances, a body and a maybe. All my treasure contingent on what I deliver, the disappointment of producing such another false coin. Self, image, cipher, I don't know what to call me, save inhabitant of these owned districts, in which I am brought to be seen, corrected, to be suspected, to be deployed, something to be done about, to be done in, to be done.
Nice.
I would like to give a shout out to Paul, my publisher, who's here. Thanks for coming, Paul.
Great. I can't see everyone. Not everyone's on picture, so well.
Well, I just spied his picture and he has been so wonderful to work with. And pretty soon he'll have a new 2022 winner, I hope, of the 3 Mile Harbor Book Prize.
That's good, good. So before you read, we're at a good point. Let's have the audience, because we do have a good group here today, ask some questions or comments. I think those who have been here before know, maybe I'm going to be Shakespearean here. Don't let the poet off easy. Ask the tough questions. Or give her some nice comments. I think that's what we do. It's more of a conversation than always just a reading. So anybody want to chime in? James, you're muted, James.
Thank you for noticing that. Am I coming through?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I wondered if Elizabeth and good to see you again, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, you were just yesterday on the New England Poetry Club Zoom, and here you are again.
And here you are again. Thanks, James.
Sure. And I've been reading Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, not Harris. And have you read it?
I loved that series, the 3 books. I thought they were amazing.
She really zeroes in on Anne Boleyn. I mean, she really zeroes in on Anne Boleyn. Wow. And there's a lot of agency there for Anne Boleyn. In your poem, she often felt like a pit and a plum, and she's done with and moved around like a chess piece. And that was also very much what was done to women. But according to how Hilary sees Anne Boleyn, she and Cromwell were tight. She knew he was a maker of kings and queens.
Yeah.
And oh my goodness. Anyway, it's a plug for everyone to read Wolf Hall and to be very careful about learning all the characters before you start, because you'll have to read it again if you don't, so you can know who is you and she and him and her. It's like being dropped into the middle of the Middle Ages, and you have to tattoo yourself. Anyway, just the last question. What's the name of that play you said was all about Henry VIII?
It's so it's called All Is True.
Never heard of it.
Or I think or the history of Henry VIII, but I think it's one that almost never gets produced.
All Is True, or the history of Henry VIII.
Yes, of King Henry VIII.
History of Henry VIII. Okay. That would be fascinating after reading this book to see Shakespeare's look at it.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I don't think Cromwell plays a big role in Shakespeare's play, but I can't remember.
He certainly plays a role in Hilary's novel.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's big. Okay, thank you very much. Good to hear you.
Thank you for coming.
Sure.
Anybody else have a question or comment? Ruth, go ahead. You're muted. Yeah, there you go. Good.
I would love to hear another poem. And I mean, there's so many wonderful female characters, and I wondered if you've got one you'd like to read that's, say, about Ophelia or Miranda or somebody from Much Ado About Nothing. You know, one of those really strong characters. Or you pick just one more poem would be lovely.
Oh, yeah, we're going to have more
okay.
poems after that.
Oh, there will
Q&A.
be. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Maybe I shouldn't rush. All right, then
No,
I'll
that's
ask another question. One of the challenges seems to me that some people know all of Shakespeare and some people don't. And I wondered if you ran into problems writing with wondering how much plot summary to give, just so people could contextualize what your, you know, the subject of your poem.
So I did think about that a lot. And the book has a fairly extensive notes section at the end of it where I talk a little bit about the plays, but I also, I'm always worried that I might be sounding like a know-it-all. So I also didn't want to over-explain everything. You know, it's tough to find the right balance there. However, I hope that a lot of the poems stand alone so that even if you don't know really the source material, the experience that I'm writing about has its own narrative arc without being completely reliant on the on knowing the play. Like, I mean, I think in subject, the poem that I just read, it's helpful to know that it's Anne Boleyn was the speaker of the poem, but the idea of being subjected and being restrained and being a pawn, I think is not necessary to know the source text to be able to understand how that operates and the way that a woman's identity can be so dependent on the uses that a social structure sees for her. I hope. And also, I will read a poem that I wasn't going to read that is actually from one of my favorite female characters, but not one of the ones maybe that you're thinking of. So this one's for you, Ruth, because you asked. So this poem is from As You Like It, and there are great female characters in As You Like It, but my absolute favorite character in As You Like It is a minor character named Audrey, who's a goat herd. And she sees, to my mind, she's the best character in the whole play, because in As You Like It, there are a bunch of court people who go to live in the forest for various different reasons. But mostly what you need to know is that there's all of these city folks out in the country, like living like, you know, the country is this wonderful, slow place of you know, this wonderful, slow pace of life. And Audrey, the goat herd, is like, no, I want to live in the court. And she ends up engaged to the fool, the literal jester, who is this gross old man, because she's like, yeah, but you know what? Like, I'm going to go live in London now. And so this is her reflection on her life at the end of her life after having married Touchstone. It's called Audrey Reflects. And her epigraph here is, I hope it is no dishonest desire to be a woman of the world. Audrey reflects. The first time I saw his astonishment to find shit on the bottom of his shoe, I saw a passage to another realm. I couldn't read to make comparisons. Still, I knew that he could be my Virgil, embodied as a fool. I never cared for looks out in the pasture anyhow. Once you've supervised the randy billies, notching their conquests on the meadow gate, you know how long a nanny's worth will last. And unlike some, I had no need be told I wasn't for all markets. Getting out had never seemed a possibility. What did I know beyond goat milk, goat meat, goat turds? I knew spring in Arden Forest does not last, that those towny greenwood twits would rot and splinter in the winter cold. City fools, what fools would leave the city? They laughed at Touchstone, but he knew the truth. Fires, music, dancing, roast fowl, feather beds to sleep in. As age dwindles our powers, such memories of warmth recall us to our bodies in which we have lived so well.
I think you really enjoyed your Shakespeare journey. Maybe it's not over yet.
No, yeah, well, I still think about it a lot. And I recommend it to any writer who wants a kind of symphonic experience of language. I really felt that my own writing became so much richer, not even just in content, but in the sounds of language through the experience of being immersed in Shakespeare's language for that time. So I've actually been thinking about doing it again because I feel like the magical effects are starting to wear off and maybe I need to repeat the journey.
It's another question. There was, I don't know if it was in the Times or the Globe, there was a Shakespeare book that was published late last year. And it was almost like, Shakespeare's life in 1 year, whatever, when he wrote a bunch of plays. I just don't know if you ran across that. It was like kind of this, it got very well reviewed. It was like, whatever, real life of what was going on at the time and things like that. So
I know The Year of Lear, which I think is William Shapiro. And
Yeah.
then there was a book there was another book that was sort of about like Shakespeare's writing during the plague.
Yeah.
That was similar to A Year of Lear, but I can't think of the title of it.
Okay.
But I'm not sure I know the one you're thinking of.
So let me ask you this, because more questions come up. What's that? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say in The Year of Lear, Shapiro, I think it's Shapiro, wrote about the experience of Londoners with the plague. And one of the things that he talked about was like, so if you had a house that was marked as a plague house, no one could go in or out, right? So when you lived in the plague house, you lived with the bodies of people who had died from the plague because no one would take them away. I mean, can you imagine sort of what that would have been like?
Oh boy. So let me just ask you this, just to go back to your teaching. Do your students write some poetry, during their school year?
Well, I teach a creative writing elective, so we wrote quite a bit of poetry in creative writing, and they have some opportunities to write poetry, but it's not something that I typically force on my English students. It's typically a choice rather than a requirement, because for those who enjoy reading it, writing it, enjoy it. And but this kind of cycles back to my discussion about inquiry at the beginning too, that for a lot of teenagers, I think adolescence is such a time of change and uncertainty that they really oftentimes want to reject additional uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so, I don't want to I don't want to traumatize someone who really doesn't want to write poetry by making that their only option.
Yeah. Yeah,
Hoping
great.
then by that, leaving the door open for them to return to poetry at their own time.
Yeah, nice, nice. So you have some more poems? You do want to share that
I do
one
have some more
for Ruth, share the one for Ruth there.
So let me think about what I've got here. All right, I'll read this next poem, which was inspired by Midsummer Night's Dream. And because I think that this poem really is a poem of sort of self-inquiry, that through reading and thinking about the characters and their approaches to love in A Midsummer Night's Dream, I sort of thought about, well, like, what kind of person am I? I am very sorry about all of these alerts that I'm getting. So in A Midsummer Night's Dream is a kind of classic Shakespeare romantic comedy where you have two sets of lovers and one, they're really not two sets of lovers. There's a pair of lovers, and then there's a man who's in love with that woman, and there's a woman who's in love with the man who's in love with the other woman, and they all run into the forest, which of course is where all sorts of fun things always happen in Shakespeare. And then there's also a bunch of fairies in the forest, and the king and queen of the fairies are fighting, and they start to meddle in the world of the mortals. And in the end, everybody loves the right person, and it turns out there's somebody for everybody, and they're all happy. But it made me think about, what does it really mean to emotionally put yourself all out there? And I'll say, for one additional thing for reference, there's in A Midsummer Night's Dream, one of the things that happens is that the king of the fairies, Oberon, gives a love potion to his estranged wife, Titania. And when she wakes up, she's asleep. When she wakes up, the first thing that she sees, she'll fall in love with. And the first thing that she sees is an actor whose head has been transformed into a donkey's head. And so she is in love with the donkey-headed actor. His name is Bottom. And in Shakespeare, of course, they don't call him a donkey, they call him an ass. So this poem is called Dear Helena, and the epigraph, which is one of Helena's lines, she says to Demetrius, who she's in love with, "I am your spaniel."
Okay.
And this is a letter poem. Dear Helena, when you told Demetrius that the girl he lusted for was headed to the forest with the boy she wanted in her turn, and then you followed him with hopes that he would beat you like his dog, I knew you were someone I could talk to. Say want is a shadow twin, beguiling all our deeds, a double with us in the sack, a night comforter, an eater from our plate. Don't let me deny want is my sister, help me own her. For I can take little from love's platter, though offered. I make love like the messenger bee, treasuring the glinting dust the flower shakes away. Helena, you do not want these ways. Your want is grasping, adores the face of its shame, feels hot in the cold, does not care. In the end, you lick stolen love, dropped by Oberon off the back of a truck. Teach me to want so, that I should not even need a potion to admit how I have longed for an ass's head.
Ooh, really fantastic. Wow.
I forgot there were teenagers there. I'm like, oh, is that a little spicy for the teens? I hope they're handling it okay.
Unless Wendy ends it early. No, I think we're good. We're good. Yeah, we had some other, a little more verbal jousting on some shows. So I think we're good.
All right. I think love is a consistent theme for Shakespeare, and I think it's interesting to see how like clear-headed oftentimes female characters are about love and why they love the characters that they love and what they're willing to do, and actually often much more so than the male characters about kind of the necessity of really like reaching out to find that kind of love, and in the end being able to capture it. So I like that about Shakespeare's female characters. Since I just read that poem about Helena, I think I will read another poem that is kind of about women embodying themselves and being themselves, just like sort of regardless of how they're seen, which I think is a big theme in the book, because in some ways, to bring it back to inquiry, like one of the questions that this project raised for me was like, what really does it mean to be a woman? And in Shakespeare, on some level, there are no women, because when he was writing, all of the female characters were played by men or young men, boys. And so in a sense, like every female character who's in Shakespeare is already, is already a kind of cross-dressing. It's an experience of cross-dressing. And then in Shakespeare, there's a lot of cross-dressing women. They're, playing men playing women, playing men. And I think the experience of gender is very fluid in Shakespeare. And yet the expectation of gender is not fluid at all. And that to me is one of the things that's very interesting, that the expectation of how women will behave is very limited, and that yet within that, constantly women are not behaving the way that they should be. And this poem, I think, speaks to that a little bit. This poem is called Nell's Ode, and Nell is a character from A Comedy of Errors. You really don't need to know anything about the play, except to know that she's fat. And that is the subject of 2 pages of comedy about how she looks. And the epigraph here is when they're talking about Nell, who, by the way, never appears in the play. Like, she's not ever on stage. You don't get to meet her. You only spend 2 entire pages hearing about how unattractive she is. She is spherical, like a globe. I could find out countries in her. So this is Nell's Ode. All that is great in me might be made little by a word, but I will spin you a tale that brings you in again. For every orb is an icon, and every kitchen an abattoir birthing appetites. You name, but in the kitchen, fire is the force worth knowing. I am swart as the earth's crust, soot as the banked embers, hot as a devil's dam inside, just like this mantled world. And I will swallow you in me so that the map lines of your life are lost. By me, you are a stranger made a woman's man, uncertain to himself within the wheel, until you turn, but just as I turn toward you and away, as if you ever could stop burying in me desires that I raise in you.
Very nice. So listen, before I forget, tell us about your micro podcast. I know I'm switching gears here.
Okay.
This is for the audience, I'm enamored with the micro podcast. I don't know, I'm put an application to be the #1 fan, but I haven't heard back. So
You are officially the #1 fan. Thank you, John.
hopefully I'm not the only fan.
I have to say, I actually have gotten wonderful feedback for my podcast, and it's called so this is a very erratically produced podcast. Although John has inspired me, I'm going to try to put out a new episode this afternoon with a poem by David Baker called Pocket Garden in the City. So be looking out for that, John.
Okay.
So I have this podcast, and basically I live far away from a lot of poets, right? And for those of you who live in the city, I'm endlessly jealous of your ability to engage in live poetry experiences whenever you want, because I don't have that. And sometimes I really want to talk about poetry. I don't only want to write about it. I want to discuss what I really like about it. And that's why I started hosting this podcast. Like, it's basically a fan podcast where I read a poem that I really like. And then for 5 minutes, I talk about why I like it. And that's it. That's the whole thing. And it's great for me because it really, speaking of inquiry, this is kind of one of the fundamental questions of life, I think, is like, why do I like this? What is in this that makes it so good to me? And I think a lot of times we don't ask ourselves that. We say, oh yeah, I liked that, but we don't necessarily break down exactly what it is that we liked. And so on the podcast, that's what I do. I read the poem, and then a lot of times I talk about the imagery and the content, but I also talk about the sound and the organization and how it all fits together for me, and why it just feels like a satisfying piece of language. And that's what it is. And hopefully there will be a new episode soon, because there hasn't been one for a long time.
Yeah,
But
she did a podcast on Julie Danho's poem called Distance, which Julie has read a couple times. And as I said, after reading that poem probably 5 or 6 times, I'm not getting on a bus again. Although I did on the way back from Logan Airport to Portland. I don't know, maybe I was tricked, or I had a potion or something that I got on the bus. But yeah, no, I really enjoy that kind of expansive inquiry into what really excites me about this poem and all the things you just talked about. So I just want to make sure that we talked about that for everybody. So before because the end of the hour is fast approaching, does anybody else have any comments or questions? Kathy Haley, go ahead.
Yeah, I just am curious if you've shared your Shakespeare poems with your students and how they respond, if so.
So no, I don't typically share my writing with students unless I feel like it's very curricular oriented, for 2 reasons. One, because I like to have a certain amount of separation of identity. And 2, because I really don't like my own self to be kind of grandstanding in the classroom. Like, the classroom is about student experience. And, I don't want to I feel like I am doing that right now, like to Miss Copeland's class, but she could sign out. I don't want the classroom to be about what I'm interested in and what I'm doing. I want the classroom to be about what students are interested in. And I figure if they want to read my poetry, there's plenty of it online. They can Google me. And sometimes they do. Sometimes they do, because I will tell them. Well, maybe one exception to that is that when we're doing research projects at the end of the year, I talk to them about the research that I did for this book and also for the collection that I'm writing now. because research doesn't have to end with an analytical paper, you know, that
Absolutely.
like-
Yeah.
research is a wonderful part of human existence when you're you know, when you have inquiry.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was a teacher for 40 years, so and a
Oh.
student-centered classroom. So I completely relate to what you're saying. But if you were to teach a play that you've written something about, I would encourage you to do it, because I think it's also important for students to see teachers as artists as well.
I do agree with that. And in my creative writing class, I'll often share things that I write while we're writing together,
Yes.
which seems more, you know, in the spirit of it.
Mhm.
But
That's
and
great.
maybe I'll become more comfortable with that, you know, as I keep going. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I hope
Any-
you're enjoying retirement now.
Anybody else, any questions or comments? There's a lot of new people today. Irene, just one second. There's a lot of new people that are attending today. If you want to be on our mailing list, you get a a list of next week's poet. You get a link to the recording. If you want to be on our list, my email address is in the chat. Just email me and say, add me to the list. And you know, you'll get, we don't use it for anything else. It's the library doesn't have access to it. We tried selling the list. No one bought it. No, I'm kidding. No, we just use it as a way to just notify people, hey, you know, it's Sylvia this week. And then last week we had this recording with Malachi Black, and, you know, just kind of just a reminder email. That's all. So if you want to do that, just email me. So Irene, go ahead. I'm sorry, I jumped in on you.
Not at all. I just have a comment. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate Elizabeth's imagination in investigating, getting right into the hearts and minds of these women. It's really quite wonderful, delightful. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll be looking for your work.
Oh, maybe I should. Can I put a link to
Yeah,
Greenville
sure. Put a
Harbor
link.
Press in the chat for any?
Yeah, put a link.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
We can maybe keep Paul busy this afternoon.
Yeah.
Speaking of inquiry too, I want to say, so I wrote this book, and now I have made on the internet 3 friends who are also publishing books about women in Shakespeare, poems inspired by women in Shakespeare this year. So it feels like there was kind of, for whatever reason, a little tiny groundswell around these characters who've been around for 400 years. And all of a sudden they are kind of back in action.
Oh, maybe we should have we do have shows that have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 poets. So maybe we should have a Women in Shakespeare session later on this year.
Oh yeah, that would be fantastic.
Hey, Teresa, go
Because
ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, yes. Oh, no, that's okay, John. Elizabeth, I wanted to say first, thank you, because I think I totally admire and respect the reading of Shakespeare that you had to do and the research involved in that. And you definitely had me at the Me Too comment that you made about, well, history repeats itself, or maybe I thought that certainly caught my attention, as well as you mentioning the way mothers are treated or depicted in the Shakespeare plays. And it wasn't until the 21st play that also some young person was going to marry someone else, and then either that person or the parent didn't die. But I really enjoyed this very much and felt that I learned a lot. Like you, I think I especially like the Stockbridge approach here, where there's a chance to speak and talk about the work, especially something in depth like you just did here. So thank you for that. I learned a great deal, and it was great. I'm glad I tuned in.
Thank you so much. I mean, I feel like when people are thanking me, I'm like, are you kidding? You just invited me to talk about myself for an hour. I should be thanking you.
So Elizabeth, close us out with one poem, because then unfortunately our poetry hour is going to disappear into the mist.
Poetry hour is going to disappear into the mist. Okay. I will end with a poem that I think is kind of speaks to sort of like who I am, and it has almost nothing to do with the play that inspires it, but a lot to do with being a writer and being a woman and being in the world. And it's called Such Honesties. It is inspired by a quote from The Merry Wives of Windsor, where one character says to another about a third person, he has studied her well and translated her will out of honesty and into English. And I thought, well,
Oh, boy.
isn't that what poets are always doing?
Oh boy.
Out of honesty and into English.
Wow.
Such honesties. Maybe I was born with a pocket dictionary of honesty in my chest and a knot under my tongue. Maybe my mother knew by the way I suckled that I'd cut or be cut, and maybe she didn't want to sleep with one eye on the door waiting for Alexander to untie me. So she snipped that extra fillet and filled my mouth with blood. I couldn't tell from milk. When you don't know tears from food, you know you are born a girl. Maybe that dictionary kept on thumping through 1,000 sets of monkey bars and all the doors of the grammar school on the green hill under the sky crammed with clouds. And I read story after story about girls who'd been enchanted so that toads fell out of their lips. A witching freedom from the faithless way language bends in the hearer's ear, quite beyond my own aired will.
I just love that out of honesty
Thank you
into
so
English.
much, John and
Oh
Stockbridge
no,
Library.
Elizabeth, no, thank you. Thank you. We're very real pleasure to have you. And yeah, I'm going to be looking at that podcast link a lot. So
Okay. I'm going to dedicate it to you, John.
Perfect.
no, really fantastic. Wendy, go ahead.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. I reiterate what John said. It was just really an amazing reading. Thank you for sharing your work and your insight with us. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And we'll hopefully see many of you